Tonight we are going to do a celebration of World Social Work Day, looking at not so much there's a sub-theme, I suppose. So the theme of this year's World Social Work Day is co-building a new eco-social world, leaving no one behind. I love World Social Work Day, and I've been celebrating World Social Work Day for many years. I worked for the International Federation of Social Workers for quite a long time, alongside of Anna, who is currently the IFSW president, and she is leading in Romania at the moment lots of camps for people from Ukraine, and IFSW are doing amazing things actually at the borders and within Ukraine too. So, but for years, I have really enjoyed celebrating World Social Work Day. I've learned a lot about it. I'm hoping to be able to share little bits about that with you tonight. So if you're here for the first time, my name's Siobhan McLean. I've been a social worker for 32 years, and I really love working with this team of students and newly qualified workers who help to deliver these weekly webinars. So tonight, we will be looking at the sub-theme of World Social Work Day, leaving no one behind. That co-building a new eco-social world is really important, but there are other experts on eco-social work, and what I wanted to do was bring in a slightly different angle for tonight. When I was a child, there was an advert on the telly, I think it was an RSPCA advert, and it said something like, "A dog isn't for Christmas, a dog is for life." And I always think of that when I think of World Social Work Day, completely off the wall. But World Social Work Day, the theme is for the year, not just for the day. And that's what it's important to recognise is last year we had Ubuntu, the Southern African philosophy, which is a really important concept for us to be able to use in social work. And it's part of us decolonising the social work curriculum, is sharing concepts from different countries about what we might be able to do and how we might be able to bring that into social work. So tonight I'm going to explore with you what we mean by leaving no one behind, where it's come from, why it's there as part of World Social Work Day this year. And I'm going to ask the question, who are we leaving behind within the profession? Because I genuinely believe that we are leaving people behind. I saw loads of stuff. This poster was all over social media yesterday, wasn't it? With Happy World Social Work Day, social work leaves no one behind. And I was thinking, yes, Happy World Social Work Day, but actually social work does leave people behind. And we leave quite a lot of people behind sometimes. And we do need to own up to that so that we can change it. So leaving no one behind is actually part of the, well, it's an underlying principle from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And for a lot of World Social Work Day, for the next few years, I think you'll find that the themes will focus in on working towards that 2030 agenda for sustainable development. So the UN, as part of its Sustainable Development Goals, has the underlying principle of leaving no one behind. It's not a separate goal. It sits underneath every single one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And it's all about the fact that we shouldn't leave people behind. There's a whole slide here that you can see some of the information about what it's about. The image on it shows that as a fundamental principle underlying all of the Sustainable Development Goals, there are three core elements to the leaving no one behind agenda. It's all about identifying and profiling the poorest and most disadvantaged, prioritising those people in the reform of and the financing of social work, social programmes, and then closing gaps in life chances as a result of the difference and being left behind. So it's important for us as social workers to think about how people are being left behind and to think about issues like poverty and how we leave people behind. But tonight, I'm going to focus on us. Social workers spend a lot of time thinking about other people. And so tonight, I want you to think about you, yourself. I want you to think about your colleagues. And we're going to look at the potential for us leaving people behind within the profession. Bless me, I knew I was going to sneeze. I could feel it coming for ages. Apologies for that. So we're going to look at, I want to give you something that you can take away, and potentially, because we know it's lots of students that attend our webinars, although everybody's welcome, but I wanted to give you something that as students you could use for the next year. Because as I say, this is a theme for the whole year. So what could we give you that you could use? Okay, the United Nations has developed 2 really helpful frameworks to support people in the principle of leaving no one behind. And the 2 frameworks that they've developed, there's the 5 steps that they say that we need to take, which gives us a process. And there are 5 factors that they identify that can be really helpful at getting us to think about and analyse who is being left behind. And that gives us the components. So if you've been to any of our webinars on reflection, you'll know I talk a lot about process models and component models, and this is the difference. The United Nations has given us one of each, a process and components for us to consider, all of which should be underpinned by a human rights-based approach. So let's take a look at the first one, the steps. This is what the United Nations says that we should be doing, the 5 steps that we should be taking in making sure that no one is left behind. They start off, step 1 is about identifying who is being left behind and in what ways they're being left behind, and who amongst them is the furthest behind. Step 2 is about analysing that information, analysing the evidence we've got, and then prioritising the work that we need to do. And then step 3 is thinking about what we should do, using the evidence that we've generated to develop a plan. Step 4 and 5 are about the management and oversight of this. So step 4 is measure and monitor progress. And step 5 is about advancing accountability to ensure that change actually happens. In many ways, for me, this is reflective of the social work process. This is what we do as social workers. We do an assessment and we gather evidence, then we analyse the evidence, and then we use the evidence to develop an intervention plan. And then we measure and monitor and make sure that change is happening. So those 5 steps, I think, are really helpful for us to think about, and they link back into the what, why, how framework that if you come to lots of these sessions, you know I talk about a lot. But what I really want to do tonight is focus in on the second framework that the United Nations give us, because I think it is brilliant. For me, it's been so helpful looking at this second framework. I mean, I know I'm always more interested in component models because I think they work much better in social work. But this is taken, both of these frameworks, the steps and the components, are taken from the United Nations Social Development Goals UN country teams. It's the operational guide for making sure that no one is left behind, where you'll find these. And this is freely available on the internet. We'll send you the resources out in the follow-up email. But these are the 5 factors that the United Nations say we need to consider when we're thinking about who is being left behind. And it takes us through, this framework is colour-coded, and it takes us through 5 different aspects. The intersection, remember we talk a lot about intersectionality in our webinars. Each of these components connects with the other, and at the intersection of them all, that's why people face multiple reinforcing sources of deprivation and inequality, which make them more likely to be left behind. As a student social worker, if you're on placement, you could look at this. You could look at this framework to think about each of the people that you're working with, each of the families that you support. Think about each of these 5 areas, break it down. Think about the discrimination the family is facing. Think about their vulnerability to shock. Think about governance and how legislation is impacting on the situation. Think about their socio-economic status and their geography. Take that to supervision. You will be showing your abilities in so many areas of social work if you are able to do this. Use it in assignments to think about deprivation and how deprivation intersects. How do we analyse deprivation? We need to move beyond some of the models that we've used in the past, which look at deprivation on a simple linear level. And we need to move much more towards looking at the components. And so that's what I'm going to encourage you to do tonight. But tonight, we're going to use each of those 5 factors that the United Nations suggests, and we're going to look at the profession of social work. And we're going to look at what is social work doing about social workers and about student social workers and about newly qualified social workers in relation to these 5 areas. Because you could think about yourself in relation to those 5 factors. Lots of photographs tonight have been taken by Brett, our team member. I think Brett is probably going to regret letting on that he could take photographs, because now I'm just like sending him, can you send us a photo of this? Can you do a photo of that? And he's done loads of photos for me tonight and lots of photoshopping, but he's got COVID. So we are sending our love to Brett, but thank you for these pictures. And this is a photo of Brett's hands. He took them himself. It's a Brett selfie photo, but of his hands, because I wanted us to look at tonight what is in our hands. Because for me, I think what the UN have given us is really valuable frameworks for us to think about how people are left behind and what we can do about it. It can help us to think about what is in our hands. We're all watching the news at the moment and we're all feeling completely torn by what's going on, but questioning ourselves and thinking, what can we do? And sometimes, especially things like United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, they feel so lofty. You know, they've been set up in UN headquarters in, you know, New York and in Geneva and all. And what do we do? Well, actually, this is what we do. We've got the 5 steps and the 5 factors, and you can use each of those. So let's go through the 5 factors in relation to social work. Let's start off with, I've tried to colour code the slides. So the green factor is discrimination. Well, you know, it's really easy, isn't it? Because we all sit and we say, you know, well, social work is an anti-oppressive, anti-discriminatory profession. So we've got no problems there. We're not discriminating against anybody, are we? But we know that we are. These are some of the facts and figures that Prospera Tedham shared with us in her webinar, Continuing the Conversation. We know that students from Black and minoritized backgrounds are less satisfied with their practice learning experiences in the UK. And we know that Black students tell us that it's discriminatory behaviours and attitudes amongst their practice educators, other professionals, service users that contribute to the different experiences that they have. Claudia Bernard's research tells us that. We know that gay and lesbian students experience discrimination throughout social work training programmes. Prospera herself has identified and talked to us extensively about the presence of racism on placements. We know that Black social work students experience a negation of their cultural knowledge and forms and types of racism from other students, both in college and on placement. And Prospera tells us, you know, Prospera's research on COVID says that the pandemic has just exaggerated all of this oppression and discrimination that students face. Where there is difference in social work, there is discrimination. And I think it's really important that as a profession, we own up to that. And we recognise that we are leaving people behind. And we need to explore what we can do about that, what we can do about students, newly qualified workers, and long-standing social workers who are experiencing oppression within the profession. If you've not read the book Outlanders, it's one that I would definitely suggest that you look at. I mean, you could use it as a social work student. You can use it in so many different ways, can't you? But this was published on World Social Work Day last year. And it contains, as it says there on the front cover, hidden narratives from social workers of colour. Those really powerful narratives within Outlanders illustrate the experiences of social workers within our profession, from microaggression through to completely overt racism, from social workers, from managers. I would start off by asking the question, are social workers of colour being left behind within the profession? And then next month, this book is due for publication. We're almost at the end of getting it ready now. And on the 30th of March, we will be having a webinar specifically about care experienced social workers. I've worked with Mary to co-edit this. Mary was one of our original team members, now a qualified social worker, and she is care experienced, as is Dave, and Dave's narratives appear in this book. I read all of the narratives sent in by students, newly qualified workers and experienced workers who grew up in the care system, who have a unique insight into what we do as social workers, but now feel like complete outsiders within the profession. The discrimination faced by the authors in that book, it's staggering. We are leaving care experienced social workers behind. We need to own up to this. It doesn't bode well. It doesn't make us feel good about ourselves as a profession, but we're doing this and it has to change. We're increasingly aware of, for example, other groups within the profession who are oppressed and discriminated against. And hopefully Kelly in the chat will tell you a little bit about the new BASWA, Neurodiverse Social Workers Special Interest Group. That brings social workers together from a range of different backgrounds to talk about their experiences as neurodiverse people. Social workers are human beings and we're all therefore different, and difference often creates discrimination and oppression. And so there is oppression within the profession and we must do more. Every single one of us must do more. Ask yourself, how can you be an ally to people who are being discriminated against within the profession? So we've only looked at one factor and we've already identified we are leaving people behind within the profession, and there are all the other factors to go. You may feel discriminated against within the profession. We know that we are leaving people behind. And then if we think about vulnerability to shocks, you know, the last couple of years have really demonstrated for us, I think, a great deal about our own vulnerability to shocks on a range of levels. The document, the UN document, was written before COVID, but it talks specifically about climate and conflict. And I would add to that, COVID. Really, this is all about crisis and how we manage that crisis. The stress vulnerability model, if you've got the social work theory cards, I'm sure there's a theory card on the stress vulnerability model because it's not talked about very much, but it's so important to think about how people can be more or less vulnerable to stress, to crisis. And it's the intersection of these. If people are discriminated against, if people do have issues around their socio-economic status, all of these things impacting, that is when they will be more vulnerable to crisis, to stress. We've seen all of the changes in social work since COVID-19, haven't we? We've seen the rapidly changing policy and practice that's gone on as a response to COVID-19, and increased isolation of the people we support and of social workers. A lack of situated learning opportunities and situated support. And we've talked about this often, but it's that bit about sitting at home on your own. You're not getting that same kind of learning as you are when you're sitting in a busy office and you're overhearing people and you're having conversations and you're learning from the social workers surrounding you. Even when we are going in the office now, there are fewer and fewer people there. You're sitting at home a lot of the time. You're taking those really difficult telephone calls as social workers where somebody phones you up and says, I'm going to hold you personally responsible for what's going on here. And they get quite difficult and possibly aggressive. And there'll be someone in the office who will hear that if you're at work in the office, and they'll come over and say, God, that sounded tough. Do you want to chat? Do you want to talk about it? But what about if you're sitting at home, taking that call, sitting at your kitchen table? Or worse still, in your bedroom. Students and newly qualified workers, one of the things I think happens often is earlier in our career, we take those kinds of things much more personally. And if you sat in your bedroom, you're going to take it very personally. So this has an impact. Changed ways of working. We don't have the same transitional opportunities that we used to have. We're clicking in and out of meetings now. Click, click, click. No time to process or think about what we've been doing. I'm hearing managers talk about if efficiency's gone up, productivity's gone up. It terrifies me to think about that as social work. What do we mean by productivity in social work? You mean more forms are getting filled in? think about the changed ways of working. You're bringing social work into your own home. There are issues about confidentiality and people overhearing what's being said. There's the potential for moral injury. We've had a webinar specifically about moral injury, but you know, we know how significant moral injury is because of COVID. Think about, where is your working space? Where is your reflective space? All the general boundaries issues that have changed. Think about the impact of new ways of working on relationship-based practice. When we're thinking about vulnerability to shocks, we've got to think about the changes that have happened in the last 2 years in our profession. I started to shield on World Social Work Day 2020 and pretty much have done since then. 2 years. We all thought it was going to be a couple of weeks to start with. We did these webinars thinking we were going to do 3 or 4 webinars to keep people together, and we're on number 77. It's been going on longer than we ever could have anticipated. So I'm going to ask you to think about crisis theory. You know, the United Nations is talking about vulnerability to shocks. So let's use crisis theory to think about that. It's one of the oldest theories that we have in social work, developed in the 1960s by Kaplan. And he said that crisis has 3 phases. There's the initial impact stage. Then there's the recoil stage and adjustment and adaptation stage. Now, I'm going to talk you through me in the pandemic, but as I'm doing that, I want you to think about you. So I'm going to tell you about the 3 stages for me. I can see those 3 stages really clearly in my own experiences. So the exact date of impact for me, my eldest daughter lives in China, and she has done for more than 5 years. So we've been talking about this in our family, probably much longer than other people. Christmas 2019, we were chatting every day about COVID. So you would have thought I'd have been prepared for it when it came to the UK, and yet I absolutely wasn't. I can remember the exact date of impact, World Social Work Day, 2020. I'd set up my car. I was due to do 9 events that week. Now we've gone online. Everybody's trying to get more events, but I was due to do 9 events that week. I loaded my car up. I did the first one on Monday. I took phone calls all the way through that day, cancelling every other event. And I drove home and started to shield on World Social Work Day. I definitely went into a recoil stage. I know I did. I stepped back and I thought, who on earth's going to be interested in theory and reflection in the midst of a global pandemic? What can I do? Recoil is, Kaplan describes recoil as, all of your coping strategies don't work, so you don't know what to do, so you do nothing, really. We step back. Sometimes we judge people in crisis who do nothing, but sometimes that's actually a good response. Step back and don't do anything until you've worked out what to do. Recoil. And then the 3rd stage, adjustment and adaptation stage, and it is this group of brilliant people who make up the Social Work Student Connect team and the original team members who actually helped me to make that adjustment and adaptation. I didn't know how to do anything online until this team stepped up and helped me to think about what works online and helped me to adjust and adapt over time. So there's crisis theory. I'm asking you to think about what you did. And then we're going to go into that in a moment. But over the last few years, I have loved celebrating World Social Work Day. And look, there's a whole collage of all the posters from 2014 to 2020 are included on that poster. There is something that is included on every single World Social Work Day poster. And I don't know if you've ever noticed what it is. Lots of you, I saw in the chat when you were arriving, were saying it's my first World Social Work Day. Well, for me, it's probably about my 20th World Social Work Day, although in the first couple of years, it was called Social Work Day of Action, and it wasn't the whole of the world, it was Europe. But it's expanded and extended, and it's about my 20th. But I recognise the same thing on the poster every year, and it's the first thing I look for when a new poster comes out. So have you worked out what it is? See if you can work it out on the chat. We'll come back to that. Last year, the theme was Ubuntu. And we're making the transition now from the Ubuntu theme into leaving no one behind. Every year, my daughter, who's lived in lots of different countries, but has been in China about 5 years, she sends me something from the country she's in that I can use on World Social Work Day. This is what she sent me in 2021. It's the World Social Work Day poster translated into traditional Chinese. And we know, don't we, the language looks different, the symbols look different, but the word crisis in traditional Chinese is opportunity, riding on a dangerous wind. The balance of the images, the symbols that make up the word crisis in traditional Chinese are about the balance of threat and opportunity. So when we look at that vulnerability to shocks, we've also got to look at ability to use opportunity and get that balance together. I'm going to share something with you in a moment that shows how social workers are being left behind because of what they're doing. And it could be quite distressing to you. If you need to step away and just look after yourself, be aware. We always want to let people know and give people warnings that this could be traumatic. The next couple of slides. But did you see what the theme was? Did you get? It's the little bird. Every single poster every year has a little bird on it. Often the little bird is singing. In English, I think it's a very English phrase, but in English, we use a phrase, a little bird told me. It's when we want to say something that we can't tell you who told us that, but we need to share it with you. And I'm going to be the little bird now a little bird told me. I'm going to share with you now things that social workers have told me about working through the pandemic. Some of these are from the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, and one of them is just from Friday. So these spread the whole 2 years. And these are the kinds of things that social workers are saying to me. There was a hospice-based social worker who said she'd worked in bereavement services for 20 years, but she said to me at the start of the pandemic, she said, here I am doing death and dying at my kitchen table. It feels very different here. People talking about my own children are hearing all of this trauma. You know, you might be wearing a headset at work. It means that your family and the people around you can't hear what people are saying to you, but they can hear what you're saying back again. People saying, I'm doing what I can, but it's never going to be enough. And I just keep on asking myself, how am I ever going to get over all of this? Students who've been asking, how are you supposed to learn about your profession just sitting in your bedroom in the middle of a global pandemic? I feel like I'm watching it online and it's not enough. You know, David's talked in the chat about never having a placement yet. He's 3 years into his social work training and not yet had a placement. Think about what that feels like and how we're learning. People saying, I feel like my home's been invaded. You know, when this is all over, I never want to come in this room again because I've given court evidence standing in my bedroom. Think about the impact of that on people. A newly qualified social worker, and I know I've told you this before in the webinars, but, I was trying to describe somebody to her and I said, he's the really tall guy. You know, the one I mean, he's the really tall guy. Siobhan, she said, I don't know how tall anybody is. I've only ever seen them head and shoulders online. And when I heard that really early in the pandemic, kind of made me realize how disconnected we've become. Equally, there's been opportunities to connect. So I've met this team. Never physically met them until very recently, started to physically meet some of the team. So there are opportunities too, but there are challenges. And one of the biggest challenges that people bring up with me again and again and again, it's that top quote there, an adult social worker who said to me, she was quite new to social work, and she was talking about something she'd done at the start of the pandemic, but she was talking about it fairly recently, when she said she'd supported somebody to move into a residential care setting, and this is what she said. I'm haunted still, Siobhan, by what I did. This couple had been married to one another for 72 years and they never saw each other again after my intervention. Every time I read that out, it makes me chilled inside. That is not why we come into social work. People feeling abandoned by social work leadership. Somebody told me just last week about opening up a file. She'd been allocated a piece of work and she said there was no warning on it, and we need warnings about trauma. There was no warning on it, and she thought, oh, I've got to open this file, I've got to read it. I'll go and sit in the front room where it's a bit comfier while I'm just reading it. And her children's toys were scattered around the floor. And she said she opened this file and read about the most horrendous child sexual abuse surrounded by her own children's toys. And it just made her feel like I've somehow infected and brought this into my family. We've got to think about the trauma. A team manager who said to me, it only hit me when I was doing an admin task, you know, quite early in the pandemic. I was a few months behind. Every month I have to close the cases for the team. And she said, there I was sitting there closing case after case after case, clicking on the reason as death. And I realized that tears were rolling down my face. People are beginning to recognize the impact of loss on social workers now from the pandemic. All of this is about moral injury. And people are now looking back and saying, I don't really know how I justified some of what I did. I'm starting to ask myself, why did I do that? It feels a bit like a war zone. We've just got to keep on battling. And then we're surrounded by the news of the war, and it makes it even more difficult. And at the start, people tell me I felt helpless, but now I just feel hopeless. I've lost hope. And it makes me wonder. It makes me think about that crisis theory. I recoiled and I found that useful. I almost regrouped and thought about how do I go forward with this new way of working. But social care workers didn't get that opportunity to recoil. They carried on. They responded and reacted in that moment. And yet we know we can learn such a lot in that recoil. Think about what we've learned from the natural world about the safety that recoiling can bring. And the quote there, nature doesn't hurry, just makes me think about the tortoise and how the tortoise retreats into its shell for safety when faced with threat. And what we've got is we've got this threat, but we've got to balance it with opportunity. And my fear is because social workers didn't get that opportunity to recoil, that actually what's happening is they're doing it now and they're retreating into the shell now. Some social workers have really enjoyed working from home and they want it to continue. And I get that. But it's important to recognise that we haven't all had that same experience. Maybe you or someone else has experienced plenty of situated learning in the past and you've learned from situated support so much that you know now where to get support from. But I'm asking you to think about what about the impact on new workers when they only see you through a screen. So all of this is crisis. And a lot of people are saying we're post-COVID now. Do you remember we had that very kind of hopeful social work webinar where we looked at social work post-COVID and we were still in the midst of it when we did it, and we're still in the midst of it now. COVID isn't the only crisis that social workers are dealing with. We've got the social care crisis. Politicians keep telling us they've solved it, but we're living it. We know we've not solved it. There's a staffing crisis, recruitment crisis, public service crisis, a cost of living crisis is going to really impact on us soon. There's all of the institutional inequality. There's crisis surrounding us. So I've used COVID as an example, but that's not the only crisis. And the crisis means we're leaving people behind. So let's go to the next factor. The next factor is governance. Now, governance in the framework is gold. And I was thinking about this because I was going back, I was trying to colour code my slides and I went back, I was like, what colour is it again? I went back to it and then I thought, gold, because good governance is like gold dust in social work. What does good governance look like? What is good leadership like in social work? And the framework, the UN framework, asks us to think about things like the impact of legislation and policy and traditional practice and the ability to participate in decision making and what it calls civic space. So let's have a look at government then. The UK government response to leaving no one behind. Well, they've made lots of promises. They're good at making promises, aren't they, governments? They've made lots of promises of committing to putting the last first. recognizing the historic opportunity that the global goals, the United Nations goals give. And yet it's not been updated. The website, look, that's a screenshot from the website that I took last week. It's not been updated since 2019. So the promise doesn't mean that much because it's not being kept up to date. But this is from the government who told us we're all in the same boat. So we don't need to worry because the government's told us we're all in the same boat. We've known from the start that we're not in the same boat. We could use this UN framework to look at how we're not all in the same boat. You know, some people are in an armour tank ship, aren't they? And other people are in a dinghy and it's got a hole in it. And some people have fallen out of the boat altogether and we're waiting to be thrown a life jacket. And all of this from the government, who all that time were on a party boat that they didn't actually invite us onto. So governance, it matters. And social work is political. And we need to be connected with that leadership and think about the golden thread of governance. And so for me, I thought, okay, what does good governance look like? And I just did myself a little list. I often sit and scribble stuff in my like reflective journal, and I wrote a bit of a thing about what's good governance. And I wrote down, okay, good governance is transparent. There's a clear mission that is effectively communicated. It's responsive. Good leadership with integrity, candid, honest, accountable. I think it was Chris that suggested to me active listening could be added. It's emotionally intelligent and it's about equity and inclusivity. And for me, that's good governance in social work. Well, that's actually good social work. Look at it. That's good social work. Social work is leadership. Social work is leadership in the community. If you are a social worker in England, the professional capabilities framework in England refers to the 9th domain of social work as professional leadership. It's not referring to management of social work. It's talking about social work as leadership. Good leaders are good social workers. Good social workers are good leaders. And so think about what we might draw from the world of theory around leadership. This guy, Simon Sinek, he's seen as like the big guru of leadership theory. His approach, he calls it entire leadership. And he's written loads of books. He's written a book called Start With Why. He's written a follow-up book called Find Your Why. Now, not that I'm at all bitter and twisted, but this guy's made billions of pounds out of this, and it's effectively what we do in social work. He's taken our what, why, how framework, and he's made billions out of it. This is his slide. That's why it's got American spellings on it, because it's actually one of his slides. He refers to the golden circle. Well, funny, it's gold. I was talking about this gold. He refers to the golden circle of why. And this is what he says about organizations. He says every organization on the planet knows what they do, the products they sell, the services they provide. He says some organizations know how they do it, you know, their unique selling point, how they go about something. But his claim is that very, very few organizations know why they do what they do. He says why isn't about making money. That's a result. Why is a purpose, a cause, a belief. Why is the mission? I think we're different. As social workers, I think we know our why. And I'm like really cheesy. There's a picture of his book, look, Start With Why. And I'm like, forget that. Forget Start With Why. Forget Find Your Why. Because good social work has why at the start and at the heart. You know why you do what you do. And the main reason you do what you do is to make sure that no one is left behind. For me, it's the basic principle of social work. It's what we do. It's social justice. No one being left behind. And yet what we're starting to look at here is we're picking up a picture that social workers themselves are being left behind because of the governance of our profession, because of the way our profession is acting and the changes through COVID. So the final bit about the gold is this. If you've not looked at it, look at it. It's really important. The International Federation of Social Workers has brought out some brilliant stuff about working through COVID, and this is one of the brilliant pieces that they've brought out, specifically a resource written for social work students and educators and practitioners. We've talked about it before. We're going to talk about it a lot more next week because our session is about values and ethics next week. But it gives a threefold framework for ethical practice. It gives governance for ethical practice. So good governance is gold. It's the colour theme, gold, all the way through, good governance. So we've looked at 3 of the 5. We're going to look at the 4th one, the blue, socio-economic status. Now, I want to say, before I say this, okay, I know how much poverty is out there. I think we have started to normalise poverty in social work. If I were to say to you about the 20 years that I've been celebrating World Social Work Day, you know, the number of food banks we had 20 years ago, and now the number of food banks we've got, it shows the increase in poverty, and it should shame society. So in what I'm about to say to you, I don't want you to think that I am negating the experiences that the people that we support have. And there are people who are living in destitution, and I know that. And there are people with no recourse to public funds, and I know that, and I recognise that. But I'm wanting tonight for us to think about social workers. And I want us to think about the socio-economic position of people within the profession. Student social workers who are working on placement, long hours, and you're not paid for it. There's no grant, you're paying big loans to do the course. This is really significant. We know that the Social Workers Benevolent Fund, which is where the money from the Outlanders book goes, has seen an increase in applications. It shows social workers are struggling to pay bills. And effectively, we know that with the increased cost of living, we know that public sector workers are facing an effective pay cut. So when I was looking at this, because not every presentation I've done has been about the profession, you know, I was looking at poverty for service users. I've used this framework to consider people who use services as well as people who provide services. So I was looking at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation because they give the best, most reliable statistics about poverty in the UK. And when I looked at that, I was really shocked. Not by the first figure that I'm about to show you, but by the second figure. I was shocked. What the Joseph Rowntree Foundation figures tell us is the first figure didn't shock me. We know that over the last 15 years, all regions of the UK have seen increases in the poverty rates of working aged adults. So working households are facing huge amounts of poverty now, which 10 years ago, you wouldn't have thought a working household would face that much poverty. But we know, we've seen it, 15 years it's been increasing. But what really shocked me was that second figure. This isn't me, this is a photograph, this is a screenshot from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and it mentions social work activities. It's telling us that the largest increase in poverty in the last 10 years seen in admin and human health sectors, social workers. We've really got to think about the socio-economic status of the profession, as well as of the people that we seek to support. And then the final of the frameworks is geography. And I'm not going to think here about geography in terms of the countries in which we live, but I'm going to ask you to think about physical environments and geography. Are we working from home or are we living at work? The trauma, we know that, well, we know if you think about last week and Sarah Jane's webinar when she led us last week thinking about trauma, we know that trauma and space are connected together. And as we've said, we're bringing that trauma into our own homes. I believe really strongly that social work educators and social work employers have a responsibility to support us in creating reflective, emotionally safe working spaces. And I don't think that's happening across the board. I want you to think about your own geography and how it's been impacted, your physical environments. We know lecture theatres are empty. Brett took this picture for me and then he added this on, look, to we've been trying to step in as social work student connect to bring people together. But lecture theatres have been empty. Students like you have been learning like this, in isolation, on Teams. If 2 years ago, I would have said, a newly qualified social worker, they've just finished their social work training, they've never knocked on somebody's door and done a home visit, they've never met physically a practice educator, you'd like, oh, that's not possible, you're daft, that can't happen. That's happening. It's happening now. People are coming into the profession having had a really isolated learning experience. And I think we need some figures on this. There's no research, there's no figures, but just from what I've seen, I think we're losing people before they've even started. Students are coming through, graduating and not joining us as a profession because of what's been happening. We are leaving those people behind, and it's dangerous. And we've got to think about this much more as a profession. Offices are empty. People are sitting at home, alone and isolated, and potentially being left behind. So tonight, I've used this framework for us to think about the profession. But it's a great framework, isn't it, for you to work through, component by component, and then think about how all of those intersect, because it's as those intersect that it creates the real issues. So we need to learn from each of those, I think, to make sure that no one is left behind. But as we start to bring tonight to a conclusion, then I want us to think about making that transition. Last year, the theme was all about Ubuntu, and I quoted a lot in World Social Work Day events last year. I quoted Archbishop Desmond Tutu regularly. And this quote's been used a lot this year following his death. It's a great quote, though, for us to think about. And it relates into making sure no one is left behind. So Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. And we need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. It's a great quote and it's really important. But for me, I feel slightly differently, because I feel at the moment we need to go upstream and find out who's pushing them in. Because falling in makes it sound as though it's the person's issue. But actually it's not. People are being pushed. They're not falling. And we're leaving them behind. And so I asked you earlier to think about, with Brett's picture of his hands, what's in your hands. And sometimes we feel like there's nothing that I can do. But let me show you something. This is what my daughter sent me this year from China. It's brilliant what she sent me this year. She read about it in her local newspaper, and then she went there to take some photos for me. I asked her to do it for me. You've got to go. It's Social Work Street, Shenzhen in China. It's called Social Work Street. Look, you can see it there on the sign. And it was developed by a group of social work students who spent 5 months. This is what we've learned from the paper, the Shenzhen Daily, which is the paper where she lives. In lockdown 2020, this group of social work students didn't have a placement, so they came together and spent 5 months renovating this street. They painted murals on the street to promote inclusivity and diversity. They put lots of installations in, like they had there's a load of phones. You can pick up a phone and hear recorded messages about avoiding fraud, for example, about a whole range of things. There's a wall that's got facial expressions on it. You can click a QR code next to it and it takes you to psychological services, consulting services from social workers. The street's got handicrafts from people because they come together in the street making handicrafts and they're displayed. It's got, this is what the newspaper describes it as, creative activities, promoting mental health and waste sorting as well. They're doing the eco stuff into fun installations and murals. And it not only produces what the paper calls a grand artistic place, but also strengthens social connections and reduces stress. So my daughter went along and took some pictures for me because we couldn't believe it was called Social Work Street, or sometimes they call it Rainbow Street. And so here's some photos from there. You can do stuff. This is magic. This is amazing. Students did this. Students are the future of our profession. So what is in your hands is the amazing stuff. You can do stuff. You can bring about change. But the most important thing that sits in your hands is the ability to do things with professional love and kindness. And every year on World Social Work Day, somebody will give you the international definition of social work. And it's really important. I know it's really important, but I didn't want to do that tonight because I wanted tonight to be a bit different. And I've gone off on a bit of a different way of looking at the theme tonight. But I wanted it to be a bit different. So I'm going to use a different quote. I'm going to use a quote from Ruth Allen, Chief Exec of the British Association of Social Workers. And she describes social work like this. It's my favourite definition of social work. She says, look, social work is about life. It's treasuring humanity. It's building connections, sharing, promoting fairness. It's about creativity, care and love. It's being there to help people overcome the obstacles and oppressions that hold them back. Maybe the obstacles and oppressions that mean they are left behind. For people using our services, a social worker should be someone to trust and believe in, someone who helps you to believe in yourself. Sometimes we must hold boundaries, protect rights, advocate and challenge. We're always in the midst of the messy stuff, finding ways forwards. We've never been in messier stuff than we're in right now. And yet every single day, social workers find ways forwards to support people, to make sure that people are not left behind. This is an amazing profession. I don't want anybody to be left behind within our profession, the people that we support or the people that make up the profession. And it's professional love that really matters. And when I thought about love, I was thinking about, you know, when I was a kid, you used to get like a flower and you'd pull off the petals like they love me not stuff. And I was thinking about that flower and the petals. And I thought, well, what the United Nations have offered us gives us an opportunity to pick things off petal by petal and think about the oppression that people face and how we can challenge that and what we can do to change that. And so another brilliant picture from Brett on the back of this quote. I think what we need to do is much like when you get one of those flowers and you blow it, the seeds away. We need to blow away every single one of the oppressive experiences that people have that are included in those UN factors to make sure that we leave no one behind. And I'm going to ask you to please think about the impact of contemporary practice on students and on new workers. If we leave them behind, if we leave you behind, we have no future as a profession. You are the future. The final thing that you'll see that's in common on most of the posters, not every single poster, but most of the posters, and has been an underlying theme tonight. Social Work Street is also called Rainbow Street. There's a rainbow on a lot of the posters for World Social Work Day. And this year, the rainbow is down the side. It's not quite a rainbow, but it's like all those colours down the side. And rainbows represent hope, diversity, and inclusion. The future of our profession, I think, looks incredibly bright, but only if we leave no one behind. So try and use what I've given you tonight across the year. Use that framework to think about who is being left behind. Use that framework to think about and reflect on your own experiences. Use that framework. It's there. It's a gift, I think, to the profession. And it really helps us to bring to life what it means to leave no one behind. So I hope that I've given you something to think about tonight. I've not watched the chat. I don't know if the team wanted to share anything with me about if there's anything in the chat or if there are any questions from tonight, but it was a different angle on World Social Work Day, hopefully one that you've not seen lots of times, because I'm very conscious there's loads of stuff goes on in this week, and lots of presentations all over the place. So I was conscious you'd have heard a lot about World Social Work Day already. So let me tell you about the next few weeks. Oh, sorry, Dave, go on. Was there something there?
I was just going to say, I think it's good that you didn't look in the chat, because it was a mixture of seriousness and me being a silly fool. So, but we now have a theme tune.
Dave, isn't there?
We now have a theme tune though for Social Work Street, and it's "Can you tell me how to get to Social Work Street?" There you go.
Absolutely, it'd be good that we could. Well, I'm sure you can.
Might get sued
a version of that, Dave. Yeah, you could do the version. So yeah, we might copyright stuff. So let me tell you about the next 3 weeks. So these 3 weeks will conclude this season, and then we're taking I think only a couple of weeks off, aren't we, over Easter, while we put together the next season as well. But the next few sessions that we've got next week, we'll be doing a back to basics webinar. They're always quite popular, those. We're just going to go right back to basics, strip everything back, and really look at values and ethics from the team's perspective. Then on the 30th of March, the session that I've already mentioned tonight, we're going to have a panel of guests join us who will all be social workers with care experience growing up within the care system. And they're going to have a whole evening sharing with us their thoughts around being care experienced social workers. And then our final one of the season, we always like to finish on an A to Z. I think so far we've done like an A to Z of theory and an A to Z of reflection and an A to Z of anti-oppressive practice. They were the first 3 seasons, and now to finish off season 4, we're going to do an A to Z of social work skills. So the links will be in the chat. I'm sure the team will have put them in there. If you've attended tonight, you should get a certificate over the weekend, and you'll get a follow-up email with links to some of the things that we've talked about tonight. So thank you ever so much for joining us, and we hope we might see you again soon or next week. Thank you ever so much, everybody. Goodbye. Bye.